once again, we're here at the place.
Yes, we are. The place for
Intellectual.
yes, spiritual and scriptural honesty. We need to hold people accountable for what they believe.
Hopefully we can actually discover what honesty is at some point.
I think we know what honesty is.
Maybe, maybe not.
All right.
Anyhow, we're going to move forward in the show. We are starting late once again, and we blame this on the crew. They can't tell what time it is, and we're supposed to start at 8 o'clock. And so we're going to just say a few things and hopefully get this wrapped up and started. Maybe I'm going backwards here. Took me off guard. Tonight we have various people on our show tonight, but I would like to say that to our right we have Dr. John Shook on the show.
Hi, how are you folks doing tonight?
Hey, Dr.
Doing
Shook.
excellent. You've done a wonderful, wonderful day today. You started out with my show, and then you've done subsequent shows. You've done an awesome job today.
Oh, thanks a lot.
I want to immediately go to three people. First of all, Bob Greaves. Why don't you jump into the conversation or start a conversation about a particular topic that has absolutely nothing to do with our special guest. Welcome, Bob.
Oh, yeah, well, thank you. You know, Chris and I, just on my show, talked with a delightful fellow, Matthew Steele. And, you know, we were talking about how it is that when we enter discussions, we can hear each other in ways that are very, very extreme instead of listening to what people are saying, where they're actually coming from. And we talked about the various ways that we can do that. I see that happening not just in theistic discussions, but in political discussions. Sometimes, you know, even in class distinction discussions. And I really think it was a great discussion because we really need to become people who can reach across our own invested positions to be able to understand and listen to each other and to really seek to be understood and to understand. And, you know, so that show was very meaningful to me. And that's a concept that I actually really value, and is something that I've even mentioned in the particular show, is that I've come to value the process of discovery more than the things I think that I have discovered. It's become far more meaningful to me. Not that I don't value those discoveries, but I value the process of discovering far more.
Christopher, what are your words to start off the show with?
Well, I had I had a pretty awesome day as far as guests and topics go. I had an opportunity to be on Bob's show, like you just mentioned, so I was a part of the conversation he was alluding to. I also had some guests on my show that allowed me to talk about the fact that religion and faith and spirituality may very well be natural, and which, of course, if you follow the logic of that, and it's a fun thought experiment, which I'm really going to have a lot of fun thinking about over the next week. It's going to be my new favorite thing to ruminate about. And if you follow it to its logical end, it would kind of imply that the lack of religion or atheism would somehow be unnatural, that it goes against the grain of how we think. And so I'm going to be playing with those variables for the next week or so until I feel that I've satisfied it. I might even have a couple more shows on that very topic, especially my show tomorrow night, Monday Meeting of the Minds. So that's what I've been thinking about a lot. Today was a really inspirational day with my guests and topics, and that's really what's been on my mind.
You know, that's awesome. Before the show, one of the things that I was really impressed was the discussion that Ozzy was talking about. He was talking about, here he is an atheist, and he's talking to a theist, and possibly a few people are disturbed about that. Can you jump into the conversation, Ozzy?
Yeah, sure. Just to sort of provide some backstory here, I was on another show, another online show called the Magic Sandwich Show. It's a show I enjoy watching. It's a show that's filled with very prominent atheistic YouTubers who have sort of led the charge online, advocating for atheism, secularism, scientific rationalism, and against religion and religiosity. And some of the people on this show and a lot of the regular viewers tend to be fairly hardline, hard-nosed atheists. And the host of the show, DPR Jones, a friend of mine, and I was on the show and we were talking, and someone asked a question about the New Covenant group. And my friend DPR Jones is wondering, well, what is the point? What is the point of this sort of interfaithless dialogue that you have, with theists and atheists? What is the point? And so we had a long discussion about that. It makes some people a little uncomfortable. It seems a little too accommodationist, and there's a concern that people have to put their views in their pockets, and they can't talk openly and freely and say what they think. So we had a nice discussion about that, and I think we opened up some minds, and I suspect you might have an influx of hard-nosed atheists knocking on the door, wanting to peer in and see what goes on here, because I think we managed to sort of get across the idea that there are very good and fruitful conversations to be had here. And Christopher Maute joined the conversation and saved the day by saying much more eloquently everything that needed to be said that I, in my stammering way, could not say. So it was terrific.
I would like to say that Ozzy was articulate and eloquent. He did a fantastic job standing up for what the reasons why he enjoys the New Covenant group and what he sees as the benefits in the New Covenant group. So he's certainly being very modest.
Well, we do thank you for the kind words. I saw John laughing or possibly smiling when you heard this topic or this question come up. So what are your thoughts concerning what Ozzy was addressing?
Well, I know Ozzy does a great job of both keeping conversations going and keeping conversations on track. I've been the beneficiary of even his corrections and clarifications of things that are kind of fumbling and stumbling out of my own mouth. So I'm not surprised that as Ozzy is an excellent representative of what the New Covenant group is about.
Well, thank you. I want to bring Jim Palmer into the show at this point, but I want everyone to feel the liberty that they can jump into a conversation with Jim, and maybe we can overwhelm him. And Jim, please understand, there are as many atheists. There are as many atheists here, if not more, than theists. And so, welcome to the New Covenant group tonight, Jim.
It's great being here. Thanks. It's good to be back. It's funny, I was listening to just the dialogue that's happened so far. And of course, a lot of the writing I do tends to raise the ire of, people from different religious traditions. I think the thing that I've found is that, a lot of people are, arguing or maintaining a position typically. But what I've discovered is that if you push past the position, that at least I typically find that the interests are very similar. When you drill through everything, it seems to me that there's a lot of similarities among all human beings. We all want to be free. We want to all experience love. We want to belong. We want to feel some sense of significance. We carry the same fears. We fear being alone. We fear not being enough. We fear failure. We want our children to be happy and healthy and whole. I don't think any of us would disagree on the values of love and compassion. And so it seems like sometimes the ideological or theological positions, they can become, they divide and separate us, but the people behind those positions, there's a lot of similarity. We're all human beings, and down past all that deep inside, there's, I think, a common thread that we all connect to. And I think all the religious traditions kind of identify that, that desire for love and compassion, is, of course, a core theme of all of them. So, I guess that was the thing that crossed my mind, especially just kind of hearing, I'm kind of coming into it, I guess, a little late and haven't been part of, the discussions today, but it's just what crossed my mind in terms of just hearing what's been shared so far.
You're exactly right. I think, at the end of the day, when we all lay down and try to get a good night's rest, we are all human. And I don't think at nighttime we lay down and say, I'm an atheist, I'm a theist, I'm a whatever. We probably don't even think we're human, but we just lay down to get some rest. And Abraham Maslow, he was exactly right. We all have the basic needs, and we all have basic instincts.
Nice.
And one day, I'm kind of like Martin Luther King Jr. One day, I look for a world that we don't have to identify with our differences, and we can all say we are all something that's the same. And people might think that's going to be a boring time, but I don't think so. I think that will be a time of where we can get a lot of things done. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to everyone becoming whatever, and I'll jump on the bus as long as it's ethical and moral.
Well, I don't particularly, on the one hand, care for labels, but then there's a little bit of every label I can claim for myself also. Like there's a way I am an atheist because there was a God that I once had a belief in, and that particular God that I had constructed and created, I divested my belief in that God. So in that sense, I'm an atheist. And so, I'm an inclusivist, like that I think that, all of life is spiritual and that, every person matters, that, there's nothing that's wasted. I can relate to the Christian label so far as it relates to Jesus himself. I find myself really wanting to grab a hold of the humanity that I saw that Jesus lived and expressed, and still consider myself very much a student of the life and the spiritual message that he shared and lived. And I have very good friends who are Buddhists or atheists that, from other religious traditions. I think what I found in general is that every single human being knows something that I need to know. Not necessarily in terms of like head knowledge, although that could be it, but their experience in life, that they've uncovered something about what it means to be human, what this journey is about. So I tend to come to people with the recognition that, there's something that I can take away that's going to matter for my journey. And I really find that to be true, with the interactions that I have with people, and spanning sort of, a pretty wide spectrum of people that have all kinds of different philosophical, religious, spiritual beliefs.
Well, hi, Jim. This is John Shook. I'm glad to meet you through Skype. How are you doing tonight?
Good, John. Thanks.
I really enjoyed your blog, and I encourage people to go find Jim Palmer. Just Google it. You'll find the blog. You're a frequent blogger. So much material. It's almost like there's a whole nother book there waiting for people to explore. But I wanted to ask a quick question about a interview that I was able to read on one of your blogs. It was a fascinating interview with good questions and fascinating answers. And I'm going to quote you. I don't know if this quote will sound familiar because you're so often quoted, but it'll sound familiar real quick. You were talking about Christianity, and you say, and I'm going to quote here verbatim because I took care to write down the words, the hallmark of Christianity seems to be have become about who is excluded rather than who's included, I suppose. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Well, I think, over the years, what I've discovered in general is that there are many people who feel alienated from organized or institutional Christianity, and yet have a hunch that Jesus himself, his life and his message, is something that is deeply profound and relevant to their journey as a human being in life, but it's difficult to separate the two if you've been, involved in organized or institutional Christianity over a period of time. That's not to say that all expressions of organized Christianity are wrong or not getting it right, but a lot of the people who contact me or that I've connected with over the years have been people that have felt disenfranchised by organized Christianity. And a lot of those people feel that way because they felt like that they've had to fit into a certain theological mode, political mode. There's sort of a script that people seem to feel that they've got to read from and live from in order to be good standing members in the Christianity that they've been involved in. And, so for those and other reasons, I think many people feel like that there's too many expectations, too many rules and rituals that exclude people. And so I find that, a lot of people have grown disinterested, in organized Christianity, and yet they are more interested in pursuing the message of Jesus and how it relates. So, I think that's probably, some of what I was thinking there. I wrote a friend of mine is a waitress at Waffle House, and she particularly would share how, she would, try to get off work to go to church on Sunday mornings, and she'd be wearing her Waffle House uniform. And she said, I would go into church and people would look at me as if I was a prostitute or something because, I wasn't, fulfilling the script. I wasn't wearing the right thing. I wasn't sort of fitting into the environment or the subculture of that particular Christian church. And so, I think that has a lot to do with it, is that the feeling that perhaps sometimes organized Christianity doesn't really represent people and the diversity and, eccentricity of their lives.
Yeah. One of the things that has really impressed me over the last, I think, 2 years that we've known you, you keep writing about this particular topic with different words, but you really came out and nuanced a point by stating something similar to this: erasing the lines that divide us.
I love that. I love that.
That was so impressive, Bob. That was so impressive, Jim. That was just something that really challenged me. We are trying to gather atheists and theists alike and trying to bring people together, but you really nailed it when you said erasing those lines. I want you to speak about that for a moment, because I want to be a student. I want to listen to your heart here, because I think that you have something to say, not just to theists, but also to atheists, about what would build meaningful community with this mindset or this idea.
Well, I think for me, religion taught me to split up and divide up the world in a lot of different ways, and to understand life in a very fractured and divided way. And there's so many examples, perhaps the most, the us and them mentality is a good example that splits up the world, and the us is whatever your particular philosophy, religion, or spirituality is, and everybody else is the them. There's also this false division, I think, that is often made between secular and spiritual. It's the same kind of radical division, I think, that people do with Jesus, is that we can't really let Jesus be fully divine and fully human. He can be fully divine and maybe sort of human, but really couldn't be fully both, because we're uncomfortable with the idea of the two being true at the same time. So we divide things up. dividing secular and spiritual, us and them, God and human, I don't think that those divisions are particularly helpful. I think of the conversation that I had with an atheist. This particular, friend said, well, I don't believe in God. And so then I asked, well, do you believe in love? And he stopped and thought about it for a moment. And, his response was, well, of course I believe in love. I mean, there really is nothing to believe in that sense. I mean, what is there not to believe about love? I instinctually know that this world would be a better place if there was more love. I know what it feels like when my child, reaches up for me with their arms and says, Daddy or Mommy, I love you. I know that I feel good and happy in my own life when I'm a person who's expressing love. It's nobody disbelieves like love. Of course I believe in love. And then my response back was, well, if I told you that God is love, because there actually is a scripture that says that God is love, then would you believe in God then? And of course, to be intellectually honest, the answer would have to be yes. If you're really telling me that God is love, and I do believe in love, well, then I would have to believe in God. But in the end, God is a word that, we use the human language, and God is a word, and we've parked all our understandings of ultimate reality in this word called God. And so I find that a lot of people, even those who are atheists, can't accept what's been put in that container, in that word God. And yet, there's no disputing the fact that we all hold a belief or put value on something such as love. So it's amazing to me how we become so divided against each other. Even our language that we use becomes something that separates people when
Identity.
When instead, I find I'm not that far off from any other and every other human being. We're just not that far apart. Sometimes it's just as simple as the language we use and the words that we associate. God is a word. There's an etymology to the word. We've chosen it, but a lot of people, their conceptual framework for God is what they reject, and I do too. A lot of the concepts that get parked into that word.
Well, I mean, let's just be honest. If that's all that God meant, God is love, I can see where, an atheist would jump on board. But there are so many other attributes and positions and identities that are attached to that word, as a intelligent designer, as a judge, as a this and that. So it's not as simple as it sounds. And I know where you're going, but it just sounds too simplistic to say, well, God is love, so therefore, atheists believe in God. It's just really not that simple, because as Christians, they attach so much more than love to God. They attach even the opposite of it, punishment and judgment.
Could I jump in?
Sure.
I want to echo what Rhonda was saying about it. This sounds a little bit simplistic to me. So to my ear, I should say I'm one of the atheists here, and I'm not someone who's allergic to the word faith or anything like that. But the word spirituality to me always rings a little bit. It just smells a bit like a cop out. I always feel like there's a bit of a shell game going on when I hear things that. Like love, identifying God with love, for instance. This always sort of sets alarm bells off in my head. I always feel as if I'm being led down a garden path. Well, look, you're not religious, okay, but all I mean by God is something that is absolutely mundane, that is uncontroversial, that we all believe in. And of course, those of us who are sort of resistant to the idea of God, typically there's a lot of reasons why people are resistant to the idea of God. Some people just don't like the idea, they just find it unpalatable. But someone like me, for instance, just finds the whole concept metaphysically extravagant, and I just find it I can't bring myself to believe that it's the case that such a being exists. And when people talk of spirituality, the notion seems sort of very vague, very nebulous. It sounds like they're talking sometimes about, just experiences that, although sublime, are, universal, things like awe, love, things like that. But it seems to me that I don't need the vocabulary of spirituality and the spiritual and soul to sort of help me better navigate through life and understand what these things are. It seems to me like the word spiritual is just sort of subbing in as a kind of pseudo-religious concept. I wonder if you could speak to that, because it doesn't work for me. That's the kind of talk that I feel doesn't bring me closer to the religiously minded people or people who self-identify as spiritual.
Yeah, I think I agree on, I guess a couple of thoughts crossed my mind on the whole God is love, conversation is that I think where I'm at personally is I'm not that concerned with, or I might even say I'm not really concerned at all with the idea of somehow trying to talk somebody into a belief in God. As much as I would see value in acknowledging that we share an interest in, I don't know, perhaps the value of love or compassion or kindness. I agree that spirituality is, one of those words that, I don't know, it means about everything. And so it ends up not really meaning a whole lot. And sometimes it's difficult to write about, like it's hard. I know for myself as a writer, it's hard thinking about, the words to choose, because even in talking about the difference between secular and spirituality, even the words itself create sort of the division just by using the words. Okay, now there's something that's secular and there's some other thing that's spiritual. And so what I kind of come to for myself is talking about life in terms of doing what the situation requires. It seems to me that this is what happens in life, is that, you're living your life and the situation requires something, maybe something as small as the situation requires you to get up and get a refill of coffee. And so you go and do that, and there's not anything else left to be done. A situation may require, or you may respond as a situation requires, to do something that's useful for somebody else, or to have compassion on somebody, or maybe it's a moment of great sadness and sorrow and grief. And so the situation only requires that you respond to those moments, in whatever way, it draws out any certain emotion that you should have. I think it seems like lately I've been spending a lot of time trying to talk people out of the idea that their lives need to be spiritual, like it's somehow got to be something different, or that you've got to gin up your life with like these great moments of bliss or joy or exhortation. I think it really sets people up for failure, because you have people walking around thinking that somehow life, was meant to be some kind of continual state of like, bliss or whatever people are thinking with the word spirituality.
I want to say amen at that point, because I know people like this. I have people in my family who are on a never-ending quest for these kinds of experiences that you're describing. And it makes them profoundly dissatisfied, endlessly frustrated. They just sort of quest. They're shopping around from sort of, one kind of new agey idea to the next. And it's most uncomfortable to see them spinning their wheels this way. So I'm very gratified to hear you say that. But I'm sorry, I cut you off. I just had to agree with that.
It strikes me as even kind of Gnostic, where, I mean, although I am a theist, I can't imagine how immature would God have to be that he cares more about the way you spell God than whether or not you value love. I mean, that sounds to me to be so absurd and so immature. You know, particularly if you're going to believe in a supernatural being. Do you think that in some ways he might be above all that? I would hope. Uh,
Yeah, well, and I think sometimes I think this is one of the interesting things about what religion, about how some, I guess, religious thinking or the way we approach religion, for lack of a better word, it kind of gets in the way, because I think that I really don't think that life needs a lot of help, or that you know, the see, it's almost like, I mean, I was talking to someone recently about, okay, if you're peeling a potato, and I'm going to use the spiritual word because it was just in this conversation I was trying to sort of get to we were kind of talking about this. Okay, when you're peeling a potato, if you're thinking about God while you're peeling it, does that make that moment more spiritual? And what I was trying to have this conversation with this person about was that my own feeling was it wouldn't. It's that peeling the potato is fine, just the way it is. Just peel the potato. You don't have to think about God. You don't have to be in a deep moment of peace and joy and exaltation. That I don't know what else to really say about it other than it's okay and it's enough just to peel the potato, whatever that means for you. I mean, if you have a thought about this or that and it's a spontaneous and natural thought that comes, but there's not any reason to interject religion or overlay religious belief on top of, the experiences of our lives. I think now for me, I guess that there is a sense where, and again, it's so difficult with language to try to find a way of saying that the momentary experience of our lives is, its existence as it is, the way it shows up, and our responding as it requires doesn't need any more quote unquote spirituality or divinity or God or religion to it. And I think even after, I studying the life of Jesus a few times, ultimately what I came up with is that there's only one universal principle about how to live the way Jesus did that anybody could apply universally, and it would be to respond as situations require, because it seems to me that that's what Jesus was doing. And so in that sense, anybody could emulate the life of Jesus, or I mean, any of us, all that Jesus was ever doing in any moment was responding to situations required. It's not like Jesus went seeking out particular spiritual or religious moments per se. It seems like life unfolded and he responded from his inner sense of direction, his way of seeing the world and seeing people. So, it's such a burden to have to gin up daily life with this idea of making moments more religious and more spiritual. I think because then people are seeing that this is something they need to attain, and now it's something that they can fail at. And, it just, I think, stirs up a lot of unnecessary turmoil in people's lives.
Jim, let me ask you one question, because I really want to get to your book, and we just have a few minutes left, unfortunately. We want to get to your latest book, Notes from Over the Edge. But you made the comment, and Ozzy replied to it, and I think what's making people feel uncomfortable when theists especially say God is love, they don't mean that this is a convertible proposition. In other words, God is love, love is God. They would reject that latter notion, is my point. And so could you address that, possibly, Ozzy? Am I speaking something that would make sense to you?
Yeah. I of course know what you mean that about a convertible expression. I mean, sometimes when we say that one thing is another thing, we don't mean that you can simply substitute one term for the other thing, and that whatever would have been said of the one term can truly be said of the other term. It's not like saying Venus is the morning star. You could substitute Venus for morning star pretty much anywhere, and both sentences would be true. So when people say that God is love, they obviously don't mean that it is the mere emotion that a person is feeling. That people are trying to say much more than that. But it's precisely when they're trying to say that much more that I get a little puzzled. What are they saying then? It seems to me that they're trying to suggest that there's a value, that there's something normative about love, of course, and that they're recommending a whole way of life. That the word love gets really freighted, gets with connotations, and that's where I get lost. I no longer know what they're saying. In other words, if it's just a convertible expression, if I can just substitute one term for the other, then I know exactly what they're saying. But now it just seems either to be trivially true or trivially false. But in any case, it seems trivial. But when they're alluding to something larger, something that is supposed to really be impactful, that's when I find, it doesn't work on me, and there's just something wrong with my sensibilities, or there's a looseness in their language, whatever it is, it always sort of falls on me like a failure to communicate. That's why I stumble on this when people, and this happens to me a lot because I do a lot of stuff outdoors. I do a lot of canoe camping and backcountry camping. I spend a lot of time in the bush and out in remote lakes and rivers and things like that. And when I describe these things, a lot of people say, "Oh, you must be a very spiritual person." They assume that my enjoyment of nature and the experiences of awe that I sometimes describe are somehow, to my own mind, spiritual, but they are not spiritual to me in the least. They don't feel like that at all. I always feel like they're mischaracterizing my own experience to me. They're trying to invest in the experiences that I have in those moments with greater significance than I think that they have. That's why I balk at this. That's why if I sound a little hostile to the term, it's that it feels like it bounces off of me like armor, but I don't feel like I'm putting up shields or armor. It just doesn't seem to penetrate, and so I get confused. So there's something in the language that doesn't work for me. I don't know why. It seems like there's got to be some other idiom to put this in than spirituality.
I really feel like we need to spend a lot of time, really defining points. In other words, if I'm going to say God is love, I need to define, what that means, because simply to leave love in the predicate position only, I don't think that it comes without baggage, and I agree with you, and it can be really misunderstood. However, I can appreciate what Jim is saying, because, I think he's coming from the standpoint of how theists have looked at God. Not as love, as condemnation, as one who judges. And I'm really amazed at what he's saying. He's simply saying to people, God is love, and that's all he is. Or am I exaggerating that point, Jim?
No, I'd say, I think that, I wrote a post, 15 things Jesus didn't say. And a lot of those were the condemnation that people attribute to Jesus, Christianity, and religion. And so I think you're right that talking about God in terms of love, at least when I talk about in terms of God as love, it's often in a scenario where people have had it beat into their heads that, God is judgment, God is condemnation, God is, think of God in these kinds of terms. But I agree that love is a word that's not any better than God. It's such a broad word. It can mean practically anything, which means it ends up, meaning, nothing at all. I tend to think of it not as some sort of universal normative, I guess to put more description into it, it would be more I don't know, the intrinsic or the internal response that humans often have to express a kindness or compassion, or to offer help or be useful to another human being. And so, it's sad that, so much of, in Christianity, we have all this language that ends up not really meaning a whole lot. And it's hard you have to be more descriptive, or it just ends up being one of those meaningless phrases that kind of falls out there with a thud and doesn't really mean much.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Could you make a couple of powerful points about your book, Notes from Over the Edge?
Well, I came to a point in my life where I decided that I wanted to address, my own personal suffering. And my involvement in religion ended up becoming a barrier to, my own freedom. There were some shackles that I, placed myself in terms of my religious thinking about myself, about God, about the world, about other people. And so I set off with an earnest desire to try to get to the bottom of and to address the root cause of my own suffering. And I kept a notebook and wrote down notes over the course of an extended period of time, on this journey of thinking about how I could finally unshackle myself from religious thinking and address the suffering of my own life. And so then I converted that notebook, became kind of the core of the book, Notes from Over the Edge. And, I think a lot of people that have tried, have invested a lot of energy in religion and, have sought after peace and happiness and well-being, and came up short in life so far, and that religion has been the hindrance and not the help, is probably someone or someone who just wants to dig a little deeper into, perhaps deconstruct their own beliefs about God to see maybe what's tripping them up on the way of in their own lives. So that became Notes from Over the Edge, and so it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to write. And, the 15 things Jesus didn't say was a strange thing. I did it as a blog post, and then, close to 700,000 people viewed, the post. And it was a section out of the book, Notes from Over the Edge. And what that just told me was, like I said before, is that there are people who are interested in the person of Jesus and his life and the message of his life, or that separated out from what people have been told through institutional Christianity. And so that, it just kind of underscored once again that you don't have to be religious per se to have an interest in who Jesus was and his value to humankind. We just all mourned the death of Nelson Mandela, and then we've celebrated the life that he had and the contribution that he made to the world. And I think a lot of people who are not necessarily interested in religion are interested in Jesus in this way for the contribution that he made with his life. And so I tend to run into people like that a good bit.
Jim, before we leave you and go to our next guest, give people a URL or whatever so they can get to the place to buy your book.
Well, you can, all you have to do is go to Amazon and type in Jim Palmer, and all my books are right there on Amazon. My blog is jimpalmerblog.com, but it's, the only other Jim Palmer probably on Amazon is the old Hall of Fame baseball pitcher, but he actually didn't write a whole lot of books, so you really shouldn't have a hard time tracking me down on Amazon.
True. Well, one of our mutual friends, Donovan Shaw, he's actually constructed a page with a lot of your most famous quotes on it on Facebook, right? Or is it a page or a group?
Yeah, yeah. I just found that out yesterday. I think it's the same thing on Facebook. Like I have my personal page and I have a community page, and then Don, I think, started that Facebook quote page. If you go to my blog, jimpalmerblog.com, it has links to everywhere else I'm at. If people want to join me on Facebook or Tumblr or Google Plus or Twitter or whatever. So a good starting point would be jimpalmerblog.com.
Great. We do have that in the captions so everyone can see that.
Right.
Real quick, you broke your book into basically 5 parts, and the last part is the most intriguing to me because you are saying that you are wanting to use truth to address things, 2 things that are, I don't want to call them near and dear to your heart because that means you have a great affinity for them, but things that you and or your wife have gone through, and that's domestic abuse and depression. And
I mean, I've traveled the world and done human rights work and seen some of the most horrific things in our world: forced child prostitution, child slave labor. Heather's been through, severe domestic violence in previous relationships, and I've written in the past about my struggle with depression. And so I thought with this book, here's the thing: is that if whatever philosophy or belief that you're offering, it's got to, sort of work where the rubber meets the road
right.
in some of the most difficult cases in people's lives. And so I decided in the last part of the book to kind of talk about how it relates to people that are in situations like this and that I've been in. If it doesn't work there, then it doesn't hold weight anywhere.
Exactly. I think that's marvelous.
Well, thanks, Jim, for being on our show tonight, and we want you to come back soon.
Oh, I'd like to. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate what everyone had to say, and I gained a lot, from what people shared. So I'd be happy to come back whenever. So thank you.
Sounds good. You have a good evening.
All right, thanks. I'll talk to you later.
Alrighty.
We are awaiting Kevin Miller. He is the filmmaker of Hellbound. Now we're going to be talking about hell.
Hellbound.
Oh, excuse me, Hellbound. We're going to be talking about hell for the rest of the evening, and so this is going to be interesting. Until we get Kevin on the show, he's coming on in just a few minutes, we have the Almighty God who's going to play bass, and go for it, God.
Can y'all hear that?
We can
yeah.
hear it.
All right.
Awesome.
Yes.
I can play more.
I think we have Kevin here. Is that correct?
All right.
Kevin is now on the place. My wife and I, to be serious with you, we watched your film this afternoon. And so it has been awesome. We're getting some feedback from the control room right now. But I want to bring you into the show because I think this is a fascinating film. Interesting subject, to say the least. Welcome, Kevin. We can't hear Kevin. Kevin, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's in and out.
Okay. Testing 1, 2, 3.
It's getting better, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's
Doesn't
getting a little
Skype
bit
work
better.
these things out as we go
Yeah, but we're
along?
getting a loop there. Okay, our producer is telling us this is typical, possibly.
Yeah. Is he wearing headphones?
I am wearing headphones, but I've just unplugged them because actually you weren't able to hear me because of that.
Okay. Okay, I'm hearing myself, but I'm not hearing you adequately.
Would you like to try linking up again?
That sounds great.
Yeah, that would be marvelous, wonderful. Ozzy, I want to get you back into the conversation. You were making some statements about this God is love. I'm really interested in you taking that a little bit further at this point until we get Kevin back.
Sure. I'm not sure what to say of it. The difficulty I have with such statements is that what needs to be said is what is meant by love. Like, what are you trying to tell me about God when you say that God is love? Do you just mean that God is a good guy and that everyone goes to heaven and nobody goes to hell? He doesn't condemn. Are you just painting a different picture of God? That's okay if you're talking to another person who also believes in God, and then what you're discussing is the attributes of God, and that's okay. But I think when you're talking to someone like me, who doesn't believe in God, that registers to my ear as an attempt to substitute one concept that, of course, I agree with and believe in, love, and not love merely as an emotion, but love as a value, as an ideal. It's the idea of broadening your circle of compassion and trying to sort of treat your neighbor as you would have them treat you, to love your neighbor as you'd love yourself. These are all sort of values that are I mean, we are the beneficiaries of Christianity in our culture. Whether or not you believe in God and believe in Jesus and believe in Christianity, we have benefited from this. There is wisdom here. Sort of being able to look at other people, tales like the Good Samaritan and the story of the woman taken in adultery and not judging and treating people with love and kindness, no matter what tribe they're from and stuff like that. Helping people in other parts of the world. The idea that charity begins at home. No. You help people in need wherever they are. All of these things. These are enormously great values that we have inherited from Christianity. Christianity is not the only religion that ever propounded these things, but it's a religion that has sort of propounded them. That it has strongly emphasized them, and we're sort of. I'm grateful anyway that our culture has these things. So love as a value in that sense. I mean, I can understand. Okay, God is love. Okay, this is what you're recommending to me is a certain way of life, a way of regarding other people, a way of reducing selfishness in myself. This I think is a fine concept, but I don't see the value in or the utility in calling that God. But I understand why people of a religious frame of mind would want to do this, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to modify or tinker with each other's concept of God. What do we mean by God? So I think that's the kind of talk that sort of works well, with certain people, but with other people, it just sort of bounces off, and because I don't, I feel like I'm sort of, I'm trying, someone's trying to bewitch me or seduce me into a theology. And that's sort of where my resistance is. So I'm always very uncomfortable with this. I always feel as if someone has sprung a trap, as if someone has said, okay, well, you believe in love, right? Yes. And that's what our earlier guest, Jim Palmer, was saying. You know, like you get the other person and they will certainly say, you agree. They will agree that, yes, of course there's love. I believe in love. Oh, well, there you go. You believe in God. And you know, there I just want to slam on the brakes as hard as possible and say, oh, no. You know, that's, no.
It's a gateway concept.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ozzy.
Exactly.
You know,
I feel like I'm being hoodwinked. Yeah, so that's my problem with it.
If speaking as an atheist, if a Christian wants to say God is love, well, I might reply with a naturalistic response. Love is chemistry. Does that mean chemistry is God? Mm-hmm. Maybe it does. Maybe I've just proven chemistry is God.
Maybe that's what Michael Dowd was trying to say when he said God is reality. And the reason that I bring up the God term, I think it's useful, that is, in the evolution of everything, that we understand that this is just a phoneme, like A or B or C. We can say A is 1, A is 2, we can say A is 4, whatever. And the point is, maybe we can use this God term to create an environment for transition. Sometimes we have to fight fire with fire, fiction with fiction, things of that nature, and sometimes theistic models can't be challenged without using
don't you
the
think,
doctrine.
Dr. Jones, that's exactly what the history of religion in some ways has been? Mankind is coming out of a past that was not as pretty or as kind as what we're venturing for today. Steven Pinker even talks about, a lot of people like to talk about how, things are getting worse and this and that. But he wrote a book, I can't recall the title, about, he talks about...
The End of Violence.
Yeah, right. A great book where he talks about how things have changed. And I do think that in a very immature way, theism has played a role in trying to push this forward. And in some ways that we find, now that we've moved even farther forward, some of those earlier pushes no longer make sense. As an example, there was a time in mankind's history where if you owned slaves and they displeased you, it was culturally accepted that you had the right to do to them whatever you so pleased. They were your property. But then along comes a guy and he says, no, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He begins bringing equitability into this situation. Now, it didn't end slavery, but it did change things, and it got us moving in a different direction. And although I think that we finally got to the day where we had to put this concept of slavery away, the religion has played a role in at least moving the steps forward from where cultures were at.
Yeah, I think that one of the authors in Scripture indicates that, Jesus himself was emptying himself, namely of the God notions. But in order to do that in a literary sense, he did use Father and also God, the God term. And sometimes to move people forward, I think you would agree that you have to use the term. Would you agree with that, Ozzy?
Yeah, I have no problem with the term God, I should say. I mean, in philosophy, for instance, we often talk about, you'll set up a thought experiment and you'll say, okay, now imagine this from a God's eye view. And what you're doing is you're trying to sort of, set up a situation, and you ask the person that you're talking to imagine the situation, the little experiment that in thought that you have devised, and you're asking them to imagine it from no particular point of view, not your point of view, not my point of view, from no particular point of view, a point of view of maximal abstraction, of maximum objectivity. The view from nowhere is what the philosopher Thomas Nagel calls it. In Latin, is sometimes referred to, described as seeing things sub specie eternitatis, from the standpoint of eternity. I think that's a very useful concept, actually. Yeah. Even if there is, in fact, no being that enjoys such a perspective, it is as a kind of ideal a useful concept. It's like the ideal of a flat plane, a two-dimensional flat plane. You know, in geometry, we sometimes create ideas like a two-dimensional flat plane. It's perfectly flat. It's featureless. It has, you know, no altitude. It's completely flat, and it extends infinitely along two axes in both directions, infinitely. That doesn't exist anywhere, but it's a very useful concept, and I think God can serve as a useful concept as well, and and it can serve, you know, potentially as a moral ideal. Not for me, not in my view. It doesn't work for me that way, but I mean, it can for other people. So I'm not I don't run screaming from the word God when I hear it.
Right. I can understand that, and I did appreciate the point a while ago, because many times people will say, you know, God is love. Therefore, if you value love or believe in love, you must believe in God. It is very much a shell game, because it really doesn't answer what has been stated, and I do appreciate that point. Now, we do have Kevin Miller back, and I have hesitated from bringing him into the conversation yet, simply because sometimes Skype has this thing that just has to get itself worked out. However, I think that we can go to Kevin without all of these technical problems now. Good evening, Kevin.
Yeah, you know, I think the words most commonly spoken on Skype are, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
That's the truth.
You just knocked a home run, okay? You're back at the bat. This afternoon, my wife and I watched the movie that you created, or the documentary, Hellbound. Tell us a little bit about this and what motivated you to make this documentary.
Well, it's a feature-length documentary that takes a critical look at this, what we'll call the traditional idea of hell as a place of eternal torment, and not just sort of from a theological point of view, but really from an experiential point of view. And so it's trying to look at, where does this idea of hell come from? And right now, within certain parts of Christianity, there's quite a bit of contention over really how should we understand this doctrine, and what degree of diversity can we accept around this aspect of theology and still have people remaining within the Christian fold. So it just was coincidental when I was developing the film that this guy named Rob Bell came out with a book called Love Wins, which landed him in a whole bunch of controversy because he sort of suggested the idea that all people might be reconciled to God. And so that's something we really look at in the film. Why is this idea that all people might be reconciled more offensive to Christians than the idea of potentially billions of people burning forever in hell? And I think that what's really going on here is underlying these very different viewpoints are obviously very different views of God. And I would put them down to a sacrificial view of God and a self-sacrificial view of God. And in the first case, you have a vision of God where without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness. And so what ends up happening is we become a people who act out in the same way as that God, and so that there can be no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. And so we have this entire culture built around a sacrificial, it's either a God that's demanding sacrifice, or it's a state that's demanding sacrifice. It's some sort of entity that's demanding that. And then you have on the other side, you have the idea of self-sacrifice, where if there's going to be any bloodshed to obtain forgiveness, it's going to be my blood, because I'm going to willingly shed it on behalf of someone else. And that's, the picture that we see of Jesus on the cross. So these are two very powerful visions and radically different visions of God and ultimately hell, which becomes a consequence of this view of God. And so really, these things are really sort of playing themselves out in the film.
This is going to be an interesting conversation, because we have theist and atheist on this program tonight, and we want to get into this. But before we do, I would like to play the trailer. And are we set up to do that? Yes. Okay, let's go ahead and play the trailer.
If you have a paradigm that doesn't allow you to ask questions, there's something wrong with the paradigm. And inside the traditional paradigm of Dante's Hell, Inferno, you're not allowed to ask all kinds of questions.
It's not a problem to ask questions, but sometimes when certain questions are asked, it's by someone who's a coward and doesn't have the conviction to declare their answer.
The notion that there really isn't hell is simply a wussy effort to make God a nice guy.
Can anyone really believe that Hitler's had a second chance? I don't think so.
So ultimately, the panoply of Scripture is pointing to one thing, and that is either reconciliation with God or separation from God.
Just take a step back a little bit and hear how that sounds. You better accept Jesus Christ or you're going to burn forever in hell. Oh, God loves you.
You often find folks whose map is the territory. If you disagree with them, you're not disagreeing with them, you're disagreeing with God.
I use the language of national and state borders or boundaries. I can work with anybody in the state borders, but I can't partner with anyone who's crossed a national border.
I gotta tell you, that's not a good way to be.
If someone's got a position or argument and you think it's wrong, then why do you fear looking at it? Truth shouldn't have anything to fear.
It's rather amazing to me that more people aren't saying this can't be right.
That was excellent. That was excellent. I noted one thing when I was watching the documentary itself. It appears that you have taken this into the context of an argument that is within Christianity itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, and also within a subsection of Christianity, because the issue of hell is not really, a front burner issue for a lot of Christians, but definitely within Protestant evangelicalism, which is the tradition that I come out of. It's a really big issue, and I think that, again, what's happening right now is really you're seeing a religious subculture kind of sort itself out in terms of who's in and who's out, in terms of how they define themselves. And so hell becomes one of those things that becomes a boundary marker or a litmus test to determine orthodoxy. And again, this isn't for everybody. This is just for certain types of Christians. But I think that, the relevance of the film, this is something we try and get at as well, because we frame the whole narrative within the 9/11 attacks, and not just the 9/11 attacks, but then America's response to it. Because what we're trying to do is to really come at, I think this idea of hell and God punishing people in hell, it really underlies a lot of our social discourse, where people aren't just wrong, they're damnable. They're not just, they don't just have a different point of view from us about a political issue or whatever. They're somehow evil. And that is, I think that there's this almost a secularized version of damnation theology that's underlying a lot of our discourse right now. And I think that that's something we're trying to get at in the film as well, is just what level of certainty should we be attaching to our beliefs, and what's the consequences of just going around throughout the world just believing you are absolutely certain, and you are now an agent of that God or that political theory or whatever, and what are the consequences of that sort of behavior?
When I talked to you on the phone, I said, wow, this is going to be a wonderful show. You're an extremely objective individual. But I did want to take the time to introduce you to all of the people on this show who are sitting in as host and also co-host. My wife is sitting to my right. She's gorgeous, and her name is Rhonda, and so she's on the show.
Hey there, Kevin.
And sitting to her right is Dr. Shook. He's a philosopher, a genius at that, and he's one of the best in the world. But please understand that he's not a theist at all. He's an atheist, and he does a wonderful job at wrestling with truth. And so, Dr. Shook, say something.
Oh, well, hi. How are you tonight, Kevin? We're glad to have you with you. Is this my opportunity maybe to ask a little bit of a question that was on my mind, or did you want to get around to everyone?
I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask that question, but I want to introduce everyone so he understands who's on the show, because we also have the Unconventional pastor. He's a professor out of New York, Bob Greaves. He's also a linguist.
Well, good evening. It's great to be here. And I saw the film. I really enjoyed the way that it pursued the question and gave us a variety of different sides as they are, which I thought personally was very effective in demonstrating the length of strangeness that there is in the fact that there are people who really seem to want to believe in it, which strikes me as odd. That what could possibly be the motivation people would have to really want it to be so that there are people who will spend eternity in such a place. It does strike me as odd, but I enjoyed the film. I thought it was very good.
Bob Greaves is actually an agnostic theist, for the record. And also we have Christopher Maute. We call him the Almighty God. He's excellent on the bass guitar, and he's excellent in science. He works at a lab there in Philadelphia, and we're proud to have him not just as one of our co-hosts, but he's a part of the NCG genome. And so we're very proud of him. Christopher, say a couple words.
Well, how you doing tonight, Kevin? I have yet to see your movie. I'm curious to check it out. I have to admit that I'm naive about the actual movie itself, but the topics therein, I have a bunch of questions raring to go already, but I will bite my tongue so that Dr. Jones can make the rounds as far as everybody else.
We also have, excuse me, go ahead, Mark. Okay. But we also have Ozzy here tonight. He's our genius from Canada. He's also an atheist. And say a few words, Ozzy.
Well, hello, Kevin. Yes, if I'm not mistaken, you're also Canadian.
Yes.
And
I
saw your
right now.
movie yesterday or the day before. Lots happened since then, but and I enjoyed it tremendously. I'm an atheist, as was mentioned, and this is a movie that I would strongly recommend to my fellow atheists out there who are interested in these kinds of questions. It's the production value was excellent. It moves along. There's not a dull moment. It's filled with interesting positions and interesting people. I strongly recommend this movie, and I know Christopher's going to love it.
Oh, good. I really appreciate that.
Okay.
Well, I was going to say Dr. Shook was the last thing Kevin said before we made the introductions. Something resonated with you as he was speaking. Do you remember what it is?
Well, perhaps I should just let loose with a question so we don't waste much time. I'm a philosopher who studies both atheology as well as theology in order to study what needs to be discussed and perhaps criticized from time to time. And with Christianity particularly, I find myself having perhaps, if not sympathy for theology, at least pity for theology, because your movie does such a good job of what anybody who studies the history of Christianity or the New Testament can see right away. There is no clear singular doctrine of hell in the New Testament. There's a point in your movie where you helpfully talk about three primary visions of what happened to us when we die. Is there going to be either heaven or eternal torment? That's one option. Or perhaps we're just annihilated into nothingness. Another alternative is what you give as the header, universalism. There's some destiny of reconciliation with God for all of us. And you have a chart that supplies for each of these three positions at least a dozen New Testament passages backing up each one of them. And I'm sure you had to be selective. There must have been many more that wouldn't have fit on a chart. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience realizing that there were different, if not contradictory views? And what does this say to you about the possibility of all of Christianity ever settling on one of them? Would that be too much to expect?
Yeah, I mean, that's a couple of questions, but I think for me, what really spawned the movie was me wading into this discussion and being somebody who came to become a Christian when I was 9 years old based on a very nicely articulated fire and brimstone gospel presentation, and just really wrestling with that my entire life. And so it was back in the fall of 2008, actually, I edited a book for a friend of mine that really, a friend named Brad Jerzak, had a book that really looked at not only the history of the doctrine within the Bible, but also then the interpretive history. And what it really did for me was kind of give me permission to say, you know what, throughout the history of the church and even within the text itself, there's all sorts of people wrestling with these issues. Because I think the big question isn't so much what happens to us after we die, but really how do we work out the problem of evil? And if God, you know, the typical thing is, you know, God exists, evil exists, and God is good. Or God is all powerful. How does that go? Atheists, one of the knockdown arguments against God. But the idea is how is God going to make things right? I mean, that's really what people are trying to work out to. So somebody asked, you know, well, how could somebody want to believe that people are going to suffer for eternity in hell? Well, you could say, well, those people are just evil, vindictive people. Or you could say, you know what? Those people are just so sensitive to the depth of injustice and depravity in the world that, damn it, God's got to do something about this. If God doesn't do something about it, well, then God's evil, you know? And so I think that I think sometimes the desire for hell, as I try and acknowledge in the at the beginning of the film, is just part of what it means to be human. When something happens that's horrifying, we want to say that's damnable behavior. But what we're trying to do in the film is to say, you know, those emotions are valid, but let's look beyond them and to say, if we really want justice in the world, what does that actually look like? And I think that this is the same sort of thing that's being wrestled with in the Bible itself. And so I think that can we all eventually arrive at the position on this issue? You know, I look at the universe, and the rule of the universe is diversity and evolution and change. And so I don't really think that's the most important thing. I think that for me, it really comes down to something, again, we try and emphasize in the film, is that the end game of theology, whether it's atheology or theology, I would hope is that it brings us closer to reality, or the closest approximation that we can arrive at given our current technology. And also, though, that it's transformative in that it helps us as individuals and as communities transform into people who are constructive rather than destructive.
That's excellent. One of the things that I wanted to suggest, because you know, I think there is a way of looking at the text through the synthetic models of Christianity, but I think that there is another view that needs to be taken into account, and that would be the linguistic view. And I'm talking about through eyes of people who really care less about theology in a sense. And so did you ever get a chance to talk with linguists about your finds concerning hell or a hell not?
Yeah, actually, we did interview a linguist for the film. We never ended up putting her in the film, unfortunately. It just didn't work editing-wise. So yeah, we talked about, you know, for instance, the origin of the word hell in the English language, which comes from, you know, Germanic language, H-E-L, which means to cover or a mound or something like that. I mean, even the term that becomes the catch-all term for hell is something that's imported outside of Christianity from other religions and that sort of thing. And then, I mean, when you come to sort of the linguistic element within the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures as well, of course, you know, we talk to biblical scholars and you know, those sorts of people who are very conversant in the language. And this is, again, where one of the battles is fought, right? So if you look at the Old Testament, there's really no theology really of what happens after we die, except that everyone ends up in Sheol, or the grave. And it's not necessarily, you know, nobody wants to die, but it's not necessarily a place of eternal punishment or anything like that. And then once you move into the New Testament, there's a collection of terms. The gospel writers, I think, exclusively have Jesus use the term Gehenna, which is a name for a valley outside of Jerusalem, also called the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom, which has a rich prophetic history within, you know, Israel's history. And then there's terms like Tartarus, which comes from Greek mythology, Hades, and that sort of thing. And so, you know, even when it comes to the language itself that's being used throughout the text by the different authors, there's no unity at all. But I think the reason for that is because each author is, when they're mentioning this or having Jesus mention this, they've got other issues that they're trying to wrestle with. They're not really trying to articulate a specific theology of here's what happens to you after you die. It's almost always a term used on the way to making another point.
I agree. You know, one of the things that has always disturbed me about the context of hell being in any English read, that is Bible, has been that we've never had anyone give us what's called a syntagmatic and paradigmatic analysis that would provide us with the essentials to actually putting hell, that is, in an English translation. However, it just appears simply because of interpolation. I have many concerns because the majority of what we see in the Bible is not based upon good linguistic science. In other words, we have a lack of indexical and deictic elements. We do not have all the non-linguistic elements to even put together, you know, a healthy analysis of anything. And so my point is, you know, if I pick door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3, all 3 doors seem very unreasonable to me. What are your thoughts?
All 3 doors, you're talking about eternal torment, annihilation, or universalism?
Right. You know,
or you're speaking
from a linguistic standpoint, you know, the doctrine of hell doesn't make sense. That is, from a linguistic standpoint. Neither does door number 2, the you know, annihilation, nor does door number 3, universalism. And so I would like for you to speak to that, because, you know, we have 3 different options that are presented in Christianity, which really do not reflect good or efficient linguistic science.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a linguist, so I can't really speak intelligently from that point of view, except to say that, again, we tend to, depending on our theological preference, we tend to build a lot of our theological ideas on very slender foundations. And, you know, again, this is another thing that we try and get after in Hellbound. Frank Schaeffer in particular really goes after this to say, basically, he says, we're all making this shit up. You know, and let's at least be honest with it. That these, we're building theological constructs that are ultimately pretty self-serving, especially when it comes to hell, because if we're believing in a version of hell, actually almost no matter what version of hell we're coming up with, even if you're going to be a universalist oftentimes, the last thing you want to do is be part of the group that's going to go there. You know, now there are many types of universalists who do believe in hell, but they just believe it ends. But yeah, so I guess that's what I would maybe say about the linguistic side of things, not really being able to speak intelligently on linguistics.
I think that Frank did an excellent job as far as just pushing the Bible to the side in a sense. And I think that he was talking about, you know, these modelings that we have, that is, today. Did you have?
I'm glad he didn't get cut out of the movie.
Yeah.
It was great, great what he had to say.
Well, there are 3 things that really stood out in my mind, Kevin, and one is you briefly touched on the economic agenda of there being an actual place called hell. And I think we all can surmise what that would be. To you know, call the faithful into the tabernacles and the synagogues and the churches, and to pay for knowledge that would keep you out of hell. And so that stood out. And also the atheist Robert McKee, I thought it was interesting that he said, even though he's an atheist, if he were not an atheist, he would almost demand that God punish people that were evil into a hell. And I thought that was very interesting. And then the third thing was when you were confronting those from the Westboro Baptist Church, I mean, you know, God bless you, if I can say that in front of all of our atheist friends. to actually try to reason with two of the people that you were trying to reason with, you know, they just did not allow room for any type of free thought there. And you had your hands tied, it looked like to me. So what was that experience?
Well, that was one of the reasons. Yeah, it was a little bit surreal, just because the woman I was interviewing, Margie Phelps, is very smart. She's a lawyer, and she does this for a living, and so she loves it. And so for me, a lot of the dynamic for me in the interview was just trying to stay one step ahead of her. But the reason why we wanted to talk to the Westboro Baptist, especially toward the beginning of the film, is because that's really, if you look at the people who are so certain about their beliefs they're going to fly planes into buildings, or the Westboro Baptists, they're kind of in the same group, even though the Westboro Baptists are pacifists essentially. But it's this idea of when we become so just rock-ribbed about our beliefs, what is the consequence of that? And so we kind of begin with New York as a city under siege. It's under siege by bad ideas, and can we sort of break free from that? But the other thing too I was going to bring up regarding your first point about the economy of this is that we have to remember, I think that the relationship between church and state throughout history has been really important, because going back to Constantine, you see this merging of church and state, and why do certain theological ideas come to the forefront, and why do other ones fade into the background? Well, I can't imagine too many tyrants that are going to benefit from a doctrine of universalism, and so there's a dominance of a certain paradigm, and I think because it serves empire, and that it served empire, especially when the only people who could read the text that supposedly gave rise to this belief weren't even available to the common people. And so what you then create is you infect people with a disease, and then you say, hey, but we've got the cure. And so it's just a self-perpetuating machine. And so I think that's one of the things that really quelled a lot of diversity for a long time, because you could basically sort of call your opponents heretics and get rid of them. And so I think that that's one of the things we need to look at when it comes to theological ideas is what are they actually winning because they're the best idea, or do they just really have some sort of privileged position within the church or within society and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Did Phil Driscoll welcome your exploration into this question?
Mark Driscoll?
Right.
No, not really. He was gracious enough to grant us an interview, probably knowing that we didn't necessarily share his theological views. And so, it got pretty contentious at a certain point during the interview. I haven't really heard from Mark since the film came out. So I can't really speak too much about what his reaction is to the film or the way he's depicted in the film.
But he would certainly be an excellent representative of that particular view, because he does hold it with passion, conviction, and clarity. So it was good to have him in there. I'm glad you did.
Yeah, that was excellent.
Well, he's a good communicator, and it's again, this is an interesting thing when you're making a documentary, is that if people from a certain position, if they feel that their position isn't the one that wins in the film, they'll complain about the representatives that you have for their position. And so people will complain about Mark Driscoll, for instance, well, he doesn't really represent us. Yeah, but you know what? Mark is making exactly the same arguments that maybe the approved spokespeople would make, and I think he's making them a lot better and a lot clearer. Because if Mark is anything, he's a really good teacher. He can take complex ideas and make them simple. Now, unfortunately, I think his greatest strength is also a real weakness, because I think he oversimplifies the entire world that way. But that's one of the big, if you look at the role he plays in the film, oftentimes he's a teacher in the film. He's teaching you about how this whole thing works.
Right, I made the mistake of saying Phil Driscoll instead of Mark. I do like Phil Driscoll's a trumpet playing, however. But did you get a chance to speak with Piper?
We tried. John Piper, Tim Keller, some of the heavy hitters from the Reform side, and somehow they knew 6 months from now they wouldn't have 15 minutes in their schedule for us. So.
Wow. Did you try John MacArthur?
Yes, we tried John MacArthur. Who else did we try? Albert Mohler as well. we tried to, Francis Chan, we had Francis Chan very close. Yeah, a lot of the people within that community, but
So Francis
yeah.
turned you down?
Yeah, with great pangs of conscience. He really wanted to, but he couldn't quite release himself to do it.
Right.
He had a lot of other things going on.
You know, for our audience, he's the guy or the gentleman who is contesting actually Rob Bell's work by the challenge with erasing hell, and he's very emotional in his appeal.
And he can have a very smooth appeal, which is,
you know,
whereas Mark Driscoll sometimes comes across quite, sometimes a bit belligerent and very macho. Chan does come across as if he's really trying to find something that's very loving and very, very, very smooth.
Well, you know, Chan, to his credit, he's a guy who makes a lot of money through his teaching and books and that, and gives almost all of it away. And I mean, this is a guy who puts his money where his mouth is. And, you know, he's really wrestling through this himself. I mean, I think that he's sort of giving hints that he's shifting away from the idea of eternal torment to annihilationism, which, you know, within his community is a pretty big deal. Yeah. So I you know, have a lot of respect for him as a guy who he's pretty authentic, you know, in terms of what he's going through.
I did not know that, and so it's good news to me because, I like to see people shifting gears, especially when the evidence is
I
there.
have a question, if I may.
Certainly.
Early on, Kevin, you talked about the damnation theology and alluded to this this war between nations. Do you see them as connected? That the damnation theology and the fact that we need. Some of us may feel this need that something's got to be done to these people who do this and do that. Do you see this as perhaps part of the problem as to why we find it so easy to go to war?
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the great tragedies of humanity, and I think that it's one of the great tragedies of Christianity is that I think that the power of Christianity, and I would say that the seeds of this are just all over the place in Judaism as well, is the revelation of victimage. Because I think what's trying to be brought to our attention through these texts, and you can accept them as religious texts or not, I mean, just accept it as a literary text. What I think is being revealed through the story of Christ and through, say, Joseph in the Old Testament, the story of Job, is that that we are forming communities around victims, that we need an enemy. To know who we are, there needs to know who we are, there needs to be a them. And that I think what Jesus is coming to do is to reveal the victimage mechanism by, in a sense, stepping into the role of victim and exposing the victim as the innocent one. Because what we tend to do is we victimize people and we declare our own innocence. There's a book called Empire Sacrifice where the author talks about innocence and dominance. And so the more dominant we are, the more we proclaim our innocence. And I think that what Christ does to reverse this is to say, no, it's actually the community that's guilty, and they're projecting their guilt onto the victim. And so Jesus comes back, you know, in the narrative, he literally comes back from the dead to reveal that he's the innocent one, and it was the community that was wrong. And so when Paul goes and preaches in the book of Acts, this Christ whom you crucified was actually God's chosen. The people are just stricken to the heart because they suddenly realize that you know, we've been spilling the blood of the prophets from the beginning. And so I think that the tragedy is that Christianity so often turns into the mechanism to continue to victimize people, when it's actually the religion that reveals victimage, and it can actually emancipate us from this desperate need we have to basically identify an enemy and then go and destroy them.
Yeah. I've often felt that Christianity in its history, unfortunately, took the event of Jesus' life and turned it more into the kind of a religion Jesus actually came to destroy.
Well, and see, this is, I think you're exactly right. And so, but it comes down to this idea of why did Jesus die? And see, within this sacrificial idea of God that I was talking about, where you have to have hell, Jesus died because God demanded it, because God had to have blood. And if he wasn't going to get it from us, he had to get it from his own son. Whereas the other way of looking at it is to say the only reason why Jesus died is because we demanded it, because we needed blood. And so Jesus says, okay, I'll concede I will sacrifice myself, and I will do it as I'll step into your killing machine as a way of exposing it all as a farce. And unfortunately, even his own disciples, I mean, had a difficult time because it just is such a foreign thing, you know. Even they had a difficult time recognizing it. And I think that, you know, for me, a really important thinker in this regard is a guy named René Girard, who talks about mimetic theory and this connection between violence and religion. And I think that he's been so instructive for us to help us understand that, man, we have got this 180 degrees wrong for thousands of years. And so
I agree,
I think
totally.
there's an awakening to this, and which I see as really positive.
That's good. That's good. Christopher, what are your thoughts?
Just wanted to turn my mic mute off. I wanted to get back to what you were talking about a little earlier. You're talking about certainty and how potentially you were talking to people, obviously, that were certain that there is a hell. How do you address people that have this like overweening pride, this hubris, this certainty that, you know, that something exists, that they want to say that you also is a consequence of your life? How do you get into conversations with these people? How do you approach that?
Well, you know, I think one of my big things is to try and establish epistemological equality. In other words, to say that we're all sort of functioning from really a combination of you know, experience, reason, tradition, and how we read the Bible. You know, so and so that all of us form an interpretive grid based upon those things, and none of us has a leg up on the other, right? We think we do. We think that we have this position because it's the best position, but I think if I can get somebody to understand that, you know, we only believe the things that we do because we've really sort of, you know, just had a gut feeling that it's the right way to go, then we can start to say, you know what, I think the thing that we're arguing about isn't the thing that we thought we were arguing about. So if I, for instance, will disagree with somebody's view on hell, they'll think, well, then you don't believe in the Bible. You have no respect for the Bible or something like that. And I'll say, well, actually, no, I do. I just read it differently. You know, an atheist actually, you know, everybody's, you know, the thing that occurred to me a while back is that every single person on earth is defined by how they read the Bible. You know, whether you accept it as the literal verbatim word from God, or if you just think of it as sort of just another religious text, that way of approaching it is just so important. So what I just try and do is to say, look, we all have these interpretive principles that we're just absolutely convinced that are correct, but they're not. They're all partial. They're all you know, provisional, and so let's listen to each other, because I have a feeling I'm seeing something you're missing, and I have a feeling you're seeing something I'm missing. And that's why you're not willing to sacrifice your position, and that's why I'm not willing to sacrifice mine. And I think that we tend to get in these stupid arguments because we think that we have the whole truth and nothing but the truth, when we just each have some of it, I think.
I think I heard Bob laughing because on the show that was on previous to this show, which is Bob's show, he and I were talking about the very thing that you just addressed, which is sometimes when we get into discussions with people, we'll hear something and then perceive it as the extreme version of what the person was saying and argue against the extreme version. Just like you said, oh, you don't believe in hell? You must not believe in the Bible or anything that goes along with that, and blah, blah, blah,
right.
blah, blah. And so, and it turns into an argument about things that have nothing to do with the trajectory you were originally on.
Well, you know, Ron Dart, a good friend of mine who's in the movie, he says, you know, every reading reveals some things and conceals others. And I would say the same thing as every point in history makes some things apparent but conceals others. So St. Augustine, there was a lot of things that were really clear to him that we are totally ignorant of, and vice versa. And so I think, you know, we have a lot to learn from science in this regard, is that you'll see scientists argue passionately for their position. I think you have to have that passion behind your views to even, you know, motivate research. But there comes a point where you have to admit that, you know, 50 years from now, we're all going to be laughing about what we believe today. And so you know, if you look at the history of humanity, that should just inject a lot of humility. So you know, it's a hard thing to balance humility with passion. But there should always just be that little voice in the back of your head whispering, you know, I could be wrong about this, but let's keep going and see how far this takes us.
I have to be honest with you, Kevin. I think you should have made the movie about you. You're more interesting than the movie. I really like your manner quite a lot.
Well, now Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't you in a movie or you had a part in something?
Well, I just happened to play one of the most famous arch villains of all time on one episode of Smallville. I played Lex Luthor.
Yes, yes, that's it.
Wow.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought I read that.
Yeah, one of the guys in the studio, he's asking, what kind of camera did you use when filming this?
We used a Panasonic AF100 and a whole bunch of different lenses. We were experimenting throughout.
Yeah, it's a fourth or third camera. Okay, Ozzy, what are your thoughts? What are your questions?
Oh, well, lots of questions. My head was exploding with questions as I was watching the movie, actually. But one thing that sort of came to my mind is that I'm sort of active in this sort of conversation between theists and atheists on YouTube, and people within the atheist movement love the idea of hell, especially the vision of hell as a place of conscious eternal torment, because the more vivid and horrific it is, the better for them, right? Because it's a fine propaganda tool.
Yeah.
In my view, it supplies people with a reason, though, for not wanting there to be a God, but it's not a reason for thinking there is no God. Now, atheists in this movement have a tendency to denounce people that have a milder view of hell. Universalists, for instance, they don't even think there is a hell, right? Or annihilationists, even. But anyone who sort of has a milder view of hell or denies the existence of hell entirely, they're seen as being either disingenuous or deliberately misreading their own sacred text to expunge an unpalatable and embarrassing doctrine. So what would you say to a person who's not Christian, who's an atheist, about what the Bible actually teaches about hell, and what you think the earliest Christians believed about hell? And so I may be asking you to lay your own cards on the table here, and if you're not comfortable doing so, please don't feel you must. But I'm curious what you would tell such a person in any case.
Well, it's funny. We just saw the second Hobbit movie last night with my kids, and it's almost like the question you could ask me: what is the Hobbit really about? Tolkien's version or Peter Jackson's version. All I can offer is an interpretation, and I think that's the first thing. And so, and then if I could, and you ask me, well, what did the earliest Christians believe? Again, we really almost just have to interpret the writings that we have. Of course, we don't know every one of the earliest Christians and that sort of thing. But the other thing too, I would just say, just as a preliminary comment too, is I think about someone like Sam Harris, who will accuse the moderates of sort of sheltering the extremists, and so he's actually almost more frustrated with the moderates than with the extremists. But I think that and is the idea of questioning the traditional doctrine a huge public relations exercise? I would say categorically no. Because anyone I know who has arrived at a position of universalism or annihilationism is really following the evidence where they think it leads. I don't think that there's really, because you actually have more to lose within Christianity to move away from the traditional view. If you were within Protestant evangelicalism, Rob Bell lost his church.
Right.
You have a lot to lose by moving to one of these minority positions. So I would say the last thing somebody's really trying to do is a career move. Going in this direction. But yeah, so to an atheist, I would say, am I just sort of not being faithful to my texts? I would say no. In fact, I think that there's a real, almost a fundamentalist reading of the Bible that I see so often within the atheist community. I'm often very frustrated with people like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, who absolutely refuse to read theologians that aren't crazy. And so they will actually, rip, Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion will come up with this, just perfect statement about God being genocidal, homicidal, pestilential, all these different things. But no Christian, no real thinking Christian would ever take such a literalistic reading of the Old Testament that Richard Dawkins takes. And so it's a little bit frustrating, because within the atheist community, there's a real frustration with religious folks who will kind of approach scientific data the same way and create straw men and then knock them down. And so I think this is one of the problems that we have, and one of the barriers, to be quite honest, I'm trying to break down with Hellbound, is to say, that's a big reason to include Robert McKee, is to say that, man, this is just too fascinating a discussion for us to just just have these ridiculous caricatures and then just be writing each other off. Because I think that this whole notion of caricaturing other people's points of view purely so we can write them off, that's a manifestation of this hell theology, whether we realize it or not.
Well, you had Dr. Shook nodding vociferously.
It's true. It's true.
He certainly agreed with that concerning Dawkins and his literal interpretation of a maniacal, homicidal, etc.
Pestilential.
It almost strikes me as if the new atheists want to complain bitterly about the symptoms, but never get at the underlying theological causes, maybe because they're not interested in getting philosophical enough. But it occurs to me, and I'd like to know your opinion about this, Kevin. You mentioned earlier, very strikingly, and I hope folks noticed, this ultimately has to do with the problem of evil. That was well said, and I think we should take it to heart and ponder the significance of this. But of course, the problem of evil is generated specifically for a religion like Christianity because it is so monotheistic. When you have a single God, ultimately responsible, directly or indirectly, for all the major things that happen in the world, if evil is one of these major things that is happening in the world, then is God responsible for that evil? And if you don't want your ultimate supreme deity responsible for that evil, you have to place the responsibility somewhere else. And now it becomes a game of where to put the evil, because you can't quite eliminate it. Well, I suppose you could if you were a Pollyannish optimist. No, pay no attention to human tragedy. It's not really happening. But of course it is really happening. So then you get doctrines of the devil, which is of course not monotheistic. That answer says that there are two supreme deities sort of in a roughly even contest with each other, the Manichaean vision, or another alternative to say, well, there is a deity, but don't conceive of it as ultimately responsible for everything. Instead, let this deity be a sort of a co-manager along with nature, trying to make things better, but not guaranteeing final results. Now, those would be very different religions, of course, theological paths that by the 4th and 5th century, Christianity, for various reasons, decided not to take, probably economic and political reasons, as you also mentioned. Do you see Christians searching for other sort of lost Christianities, things that were on the table in early centuries, or Christianities that were blending with other religions that didn't require such a harsh monotheism?
Well, I think Christianity is a lot like every other religion out there, like Islam. It's moving in every direction at once, and so I think definitely within certain branches of Christianity, you see a reaching back to see what did we lose, and perhaps and how do we canonize these scriptures? What about all these other texts that were around at the time, and how did they influence the writers of these books? So I think you can get such an interesting perspective on Paul, for instance, the Apostle Paul, to know more about his contemporary theologians, Jewish theologians at the time, and how did they deal with the Old Testament, and and how does that sort of reflected in his own writings. So I think that I can speak from Protestant evangelicalism, because I don't even know where I fit anymore, but I know a lot of people within that movement, and you see so many of them becoming Catholics or becoming Orthodox even, because there's a turning back to what did we leave behind. And so I think that that's happening within Orthodox Christianity, and then more within, or evangelical Christianity, sorry, and then within more kind of liberal streams, definitely you're seeking much further afield, I think, to see sort of what we missed. So yeah, I think that's going on as well. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the first part of your question there, because I wanted to say something about that.
Oh, well, I was just talking about how monotheism is linked with the particular kind of really sticky problem of evil. Some other religions avoid the problem of evil by avoiding the very authoritarian monotheism at the heart of it.
Yeah, well, and this is, I think that this is the real problem that Christians have, is the problem of evil, because I think you did such a great job of articulating, if God's not responsible, well, then who is? And that's what we talk about in Hellbound, is really, the ancient Jewish view would be that everything comes from God. But then, wait a second, our life is crap. We've lost everything. Now what? So you start to see the emergence of a figure called Satan, who's kind of there in the background, but becomes much more central. And so, especially now within Protestant evangelicalism, Satan and the demonic is like a huge deal. And so that the source of evil is going to be put there. The other place, though, that evil gets put is in the human will.
That is correct.
The notion of free will. I don't like the term free will. I'll just use the term human will. And so that God, in a sense, is ultimately pro-choice, because he's allowed us to make any choice that we want. And so that the evil is happening because we're abusing this gift. And so that's, again, necessitates the need for hell in a lot of people's minds, is that we were free to do the good, but we chose the evil. Therefore, we have to pay the price.
I agree completely. The theology of the fall of the garden is fascinating, because you, in effect, have three co-creators of the world that we live in. A God who started out with plan A, a human being or human beings that had the ability to choose with wills, and then a whisperer, a liar, a deceiver, the figure of Satan perhaps. And in the end, we're not living in the Garden of Eden. We're living in a different world that humanity is now largely responsible for. So in effect, you have three divine or semi-divine co-creators, and now you have got a theological setup of a serious tension. And I think Christians have been struggling deeply with those tensions ever since.
Well, I think it's pretty much an irresolvable one. And to be honest, this is right. I mean, it's got me in the crosshairs right now in terms of my own theological beliefs. And I feel much more comfortable these days approaching the Bible as a text that just really, for me, it's trying to understand where do we go wrong as human beings? Not so much really how's God going to balance the scales and all these sort of theological questions. I'm actually looking at it through a much more practical lens. And this again brings me back to René Girard and mimetic theory, because I think that what he does so effectively is to show us that this focus on individualism is also really problematic, because the more we're learning about behavioral psychology, the more we're recognizing that we function much more like a herd. And so our tendency, we're just at the anniversary of the shootings in Newtown. And there's so many of these types of tragedies that happen every year, and our tendency is to just really isolate this individual and become almost fascinated with this individual and how could they have gone and gone so wrong. And for me, I always look at that and say, well, the individual like that is always going to be, there's nothing really unique about that person. They're just sort of they were the most susceptible to whatever problem is afflicting us as a group right now. And so I think that when we look at these types of tragedies, the question we should really be asking is, where did we go wrong? Not where did this individual go wrong, and so when it comes to trying to understand evil, I think that there's concentric circles moving out from all of us, and we're constantly, René Girard uses the term interdividual versus individual, and that we're really in many ways co-determining each other's, the path that we take through life. And so, Sam Harris, I sure enjoy reading him and listening to him, but he's really keyed into this with his whole questioning of the notion of free will, and trying to look at actually more the social factors that influence our decision making.
Ozzy, would you like to ask a final question here.
Oh dear, the final question.
Well, maybe I need to rephrase that. I mean, this is a conversation that is getting better and better, and wow, I'm really impressed with you, Kevin. You're really.
We thought
the
Dazi could settle everything, is what you're basically saying.
Right.
But I want to give
Wrap
you a
us up,
chance
Ozzy.
to input here, and then I want to go to Chris and then to Bob.
Okay.
Go for
Sure.
it.
Okay, so this will be my final question. That's a great relief. Well, I had a question that I would like to hear if you could speak to this doctrine of universalism. Because growing up, this was something I never knew anything about. It's something I've only started reading about fairly recently, actually, in recent years. Growing up, I grew up with a kind of quasi-Jehovah's Witness upbringing, so it was annihilationism is what I grew up with. There's no hell in the Jehovah's Witness doctrine. But of course had heard all about hell, so those concepts were not alien to me. But universalism, the idea that everyone gets reconciled with God and that no one goes to hell, or at least no one stays in hell, that was alien to me. And I was really surprised when a friend of mine years ago, who's an Anabaptist and a very, very profound Christian thinker, very well read, sort of pointed out to me that, no, this idea of universalism goes way, way back. And you mentioned this in the movie, that figures like theologian like Origen from the 3rd century and Gregory of Nyssa and others had already articulated this idea. And of course, if they had, then chances are it's even older. I wonder if you could speak to sort of the early origins of this idea of universalism.
Yeah, well, definitely. In the early days of the church, there's all sorts of ideas are up for grabs. Some people have argued that the early church, up to say 300 or so, the central doctrine was also pacifism. And so again, out of that, I think pacifism and universalism, you're going to see those linked, and that's why I'm not surprised your friend was an Anabaptist, because
right, exactly.
There would be a much more openness to this idea that violence is not an option available to God. Because violence is always going to be, it's almost a product of psychological dysfunction, and so God somehow has a problem if he has to resort to violence, because it's the least creative of all solutions to evil. And so, but yeah, going back to the early days of the church, you'll see somebody like Origen or even Gregory of Nyssa, who had the last say in terms of the wording of the Apostles' Creed, which is the most widely read creed within all Christianity. These guys believed that ultimately all people would be reconciled to God. And Origen took it a step further to say, by extension then, so will Satan and all the demonic. And that's really what got him into trouble. But I think it just made sense that if these creatures were also created by God, why shouldn't they be redeemed too? And I think, so these weren't controversial views. And even when Origen is declared, or Origenism is actually declared anathema, it's not Origen himself. It's certain views that grew out of his theology that were declared anathema. And it had to do with transmigration of souls and all kinds of things too, right? So what ends up happening, this is the unfortunate problem with universalism, is it often throughout the history of the church, it sort of gets lumped in with a lot of really unorthodox beliefs. So it kind of is guilty by association. But it's never really gone away. But it's always been one of those minority positions.
Christopher.
Oh, you're muted, Christopher.
Hello, crew.
I will never learn. I never will. I always mute my mic out of respect and just never have the wherewithal to unmute it. Anyway, what I wanted to address was, I know more appropriately what I would like you to address, if you can, is the idea that you were talking about earlier, once again, is the idea that hell, from human nature, the idea of justice and where hell fits in with that idea. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And the reason why I'd like you to is because it seems very natural that people would want a form of justice in an afterlife that they may not be able to dole out during life. Such that if they are oppressed, that people that are oppressing them, that they have some, they have some peace of mind that they're going to go to a place when they die that the oppressors are that the oppressed are not going to. You know what I mean? Like this, it seems like a psychological necessity almost in our development or our evolution. And I just kind of want you to address that a little bit.
Yeah, well, otherwise suffering is meaningless. If somebody came in right now and slaughtered my family and that was it, well, that's, that's not very satisfying. But I think the real question we need to ask is, what do we mean by justice? So if we think about our own justice system today, there's a lot of different purposes. My background is actually in, I used to work in young offender, incarceration facilities, and that's kind of what I did a lot of my education in. And, we think about retribution. That's the first thing that usually comes to our mind. That's justice, retribution, payback. But there's also public protection. We want to keep people off the streets. They're a danger. There's deterrence. We want to, discourage other people from doing these things. But then there's also some other purposes of the justice system. Number one being rehabilitation. A penitentiary was a place to go and be penitent, reflect on your life, so when you get out, you'll live differently. Restitution. That's a key part of our justice system. And I think the other part, I think this is the best thing that our justice system can achieve, is restoration. So what happens is the offender is restored to society, and possibly even restored to the victim or the family of the victims of the crimes that they've committed. And so that it's a win-win, because the justice doesn't in the end have to come at anyone's expense. And so I think, for me, I look at our justice system and go, if we can achieve that ourselves, if we're going to believe in, if we're going to make room in the universe for a being like God, couldn't we believe that somehow all things could be restored? And that isn't to say there's no justice. It actually is to say that justice is perfect, because, what does every victim want the offender to know? We give victim impact statements at sentencing hearings because we want the offender to know how we feel. And we want them to share in our suffering. So somehow we just feel we have that need. And so I would look at this. If all evil people go to hell, and all the good people, whoever those people are, go to heaven, there's going to be a lot of psychologically unfinished people in heaven, because they've never got to do that full circle of healing by going head to head with the person who victimized them. And, I just want to believe in something really big. If I'm going to make room for God, I'm going to make room for a God who can achieve something amazing, which is redeeming everyone.
May I make a small point, Kevin, touching on what you just said about restorative justice?
Yeah.
This issue of restorative justice is something that I'm quite interested in, as opposed to the idea of retribution. But the idea of hell, the more a person believes in it, and the more people believe that this is the sort of the proper way of meting out justice, the harder it is for a person to even understand and appreciate the idea of restorative justice. When you suggest restorative justice as an ideal, just in the real world, people who are strongly committed to the idea of hell often balk. They can't see it. It's like the idea of hell itself somehow throws up a model of justice that is retributionist and makes the idea of restoration almost impossible to grasp and seem unholy.
Well, it's offensive, and I can't tell you how many times I've sort of talked people through what I just talked through with different purposes of our justice system. They'll come back and say, "Yeah, but there's no justice." It's like, but wait, Walter Wink, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, he did a lot of great writing on this in terms of violence. And for me, the theology of hell and violence go hand in hand. And what he talks about is, if you even make it a possibility that you can reach for a gun to resolve a situation, you're going to be fumbling for the trigger while you should actually be thinking for a more creative solution. And I think that for me, it really goes hand in hand. I'm a pacifist, but that does not mean I'm a passivist. It means that I believe that we should all approach life as fully and creatively as possible, and that I think violence like hell is the lowest common denominator. It's just the thing that the most animalistic side of us does. And I think this is, I've been pretty critical lately of, America's use of signature strikes with drones and that sort of thing. And I think this is a great tragedy, because America just can be this source of so much good in the world. And instead it's carrying out it's made extrajudicial assassinations the core part of its foreign policy. And I think that, again, I think we have this hell theology to blame.
Wow, this is a fascinating discussion. We're having a wonderful time with you. Kevin, Bob, what are your thoughts?
Oh, well, my first thought here is how jealous I am of Ozzy, who stole my final question. That's excellent. Really, because I was thinking about how in the movie, I think you did try to make a point about how the way we do view hell affects the way we handle conflict and disagreement now. And that we really do need to consider what it is we're doing with this concept, because it's not just a difference of opinion; it affects how we live. And I'm curious, was this part of your intention in the movie, that you wanted to kind of point to that, or is that just something I drew from it?
No, I mean, it's something that you pull at the thread of hell, and everything comes with it, And so when I started on this journey to make this film, I think these ideas were sort of percolating in the back of my mind, but it was really engaging with a number of the people in the film, particularly Frank Schaefer, Michael Hardin, Brian McLaren, Brad Jerzak, some of these guys, who just really, it became more apparent to me just how important all this stuff is. It's all going on in the background. Like Frank Schaefer wrote a great piece for the Huffington Post a while back saying that what America's really suffering from is bad theology. The problem is nobody's framing our current discourse in terms of theology, because, well, most of what's happening is sort of happening as it's a secularized version of bad theology. So yeah, no, it was something that's very intentional in the film. There's actually a guy named A.W. Tozer, well loved within the Christian world, who said that the most important thing about a person, speaking of a theist, is the image of God that they have in their mind. And I think that's because we tend to become then agents of that God on earth. We become reflections of that God on earth. And so I think it is really, really important because, we're reaping the consequences right now.
If I could just say one last thing too, I loved seeing Frank Schaefer in the movie. He's a person that I have really admired, and if there's one regret I have in my life, it's that I don't know him personally well enough that we could sit down and have a beer and just enjoy a moment. I really like the guy.
I can introduce you anytime you want, and he would love to do it.
I'd love to get him on the show. That would be marvelous. I want you to come back. You're a fascinating individual. You've done a great work, that is, in the making of this film. But once again, I'm going to state that I think that simply talking with you is more fascinating, to be honest with you.
I don't know if that's a compliment to me or a criticism of my film.
No,
you're right.
Neither. Your film was magnificent. I'm just saying that you're going so much deeper than the average theist, and I would say than probably most theologians. And so I'm really proud of you in this conversation. John, did you have a last thought?
Oh, well, you might have noticed that I reacted very strongly when the concept of restorative justice came up. This is a concept that Canada has, to its credit, tried to explore much more with respect to Indigenous peoples and traditions, and also the federalism that Canada represents, as opposed to the kind of Calvinistic social contract theory characteristic of Anglo-American culture. And we're dealing with this Calvinistic hangover. And I agree that theology, of course, is never just theology. It is culture as well. And so when we have an opportunity to talk about uniting great goodness with perfect justice, I think restorative justice is that kind of effort. Because if you put justice over goodness, then you really never achieve complete goodness. Because goodness, especially perfect goodness, is never satisfied until everything is brought up to its level. There can never be anyone left outside of that goodness. But Calvinism is all about making sure there are plenty of people forever cast out. And I think
somehow this is glorious.
Yeah. No, well, and other people have said it more eloquently than me, but Calvinism is ultimately incompatible with the idea of democracy. bottom line. So we need conceptions of justice that don't rely on it and instead try to match up with our worthy ideals of the good community.
Yeah. Excellent point. Excellent point.
A couple of things. Unfortunately, it's quite the conundrum, if I could coin a term that Bob Greaves likes to use, that Christians, they not only believe that, you know, evil people or people that need to pay go to hell, but they believe that good people go to hell. So we have a whole nother subset of individuals that are going to be there just because they didn't say the sinner's prayer, they didn't have any access to who Jesus Christ is. And so, you know, sad as that is, and I don't believe in a hell, but you could almost believe in one where evil people go, but my goodness, you certainly can't believe in one where good people go, that, you know, it's nothing of their doings. Anywho, that's just a thought. Go ahead.
Just a brief comment to that. It's funny. I had a friend back in college who coined this term, this phrase. He said that, speaking of Christians, that we're bad in a good way, and non-Christians are good in a bad way. Because their goodness isn't done for the right reasons, so they're still going to go down, which is, you know, horrifying. But you know, you know, the other thing too I was going to say is that, to be gracious again to the people who really hold very strongly to an eternal torment view of hell, is that the majority of these people really believe that they are being faithful to the text in the way that's required of them. And I think that if they could be shown that actually there's a way to be faithful to the text that doesn't require that belief, they would gladly relinquish that belief. And I just think that, unfortunately, building the bridge to that, and that's what we're trying to do in Hellbound, and other people have tried to do in other endeavors. That's what, you know, unfortunately, that ultimate bridge for a lot of people hasn't it hasn't quite been constructed yet. But I think there are bridges being built that people can say, you know what, I think I can let go of some of these ideas and still actually, you know, hold true to this faith that I really value.
Right, I believe that. Also, one final, just a comment on my part. Speaking of drone attacks, to me, I think the United States has come a little bit, well, we're less barbaric now. I think a surgical drone strike is a lot better than carpet bombing. So maybe we're working our way into something better instead of something worse.
Well, the fact that and I'll say we collectively feel the need to cover these things up, I think, is a good sign, because in the past, a tyrant wouldn't try and conceal their tyranny. They would actually hold it out, you know, put heads on pikes to warn everybody. You know, now I think that, again, this is this awareness of victimage, and how that we're creating victims in order to bring peace for us. That awareness is infiltrating the culture. And so I would agree with you in a sense that I think the fact that we're feeling the need to sort of hide this and not put boots on the ground is it's an unfortunate form of progress, but it is I think a form of moral progress. Right. I mean, I'm not going to say that to the people who just got, you know, the entire family who just got wiped out in Yemen. I mean, you know, I'm not speaking that way.
Right.
I'm just speaking more kind of metaphorically.
Right. I agree.
You know, one of the most powerful things, and this is hard for me to talk about without weeping, because it's so typical here in the South, that is in the Bible Belt. We see children all the time being exposed to the doctrine of hell. And in your movie or your documentary, you really put something on screen that I think is extremely important, and that would be called this Hell House context.
Right.
And here you have this youth pastor, in a sense, trying to warn people of hell, and all of these people participating, and they're scaring the hell out of people. There's got to be something done about this, and I'm so thankful that you were willing to do this movie, expose it. A lot of it's nonsense, and I thank you so much for doing the movie, and I'm so thankful that you came our way. I would like for you to come back so we can continue talking. I think that you have so much to offer the community in various contexts, and I'm finding that the atheists here are fascinated with you, not in a negative sense, but in a positive sense. And so you are winning. And by the way, I don't want to go without actually you answering one of the comments that keeps coming up. Did you ever interview anyone that actually went to hell and came back?
Yes, and actually, if you buy the DVD at hellboundthemovie.com, a little plug there, you'll actually get to see two people. We interviewed Bill Weiss, who's famous for the book called 23 Minutes in Hell. And then another woman who less well known, but also had a very clear vision of hell. So there's a whole culture of people out there, either somebody who's had a near-death experience and had a vision of hell, or just somebody who just straight out had a vision. So yeah, on the DVD you can actually see some testimonies of people who've had that experience.
So how can we buy your DVD?
You can pick it up on Amazon or get it from us directly at hellboundthemovie.com. Those are the two places. We're actually just signed a big retail deal. It'll be out in stores everywhere, probably starting in February. But at least right now, Amazon and our own website are the places you can get it.
Great.
Christopher Maute, I have all kinds of people asking me this question. Are you going to have a post-show hangout about this discussion?
I am certainly thinking about it. So if there's enough interest, then I most likely will, even if it's just for a short while.
Count me in, Chris, if you do one.
Because we have a lot of people that want to continue this conversation. We're out of time here. But once again, you really, really have impressed me, and I think you've impressed everyone here. Your willingness to be so honest, that's overwhelming. And so I want you to come back and spend maybe 2 hours with us instead of an hour. I think that you have a lot to offer the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. It's been invigorating.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's say good night. Have a good one.
Good night.
Okay, good night.
Yep.